Hey, it's Jake, and today we're going to be talking about an extremely powerful part of expressions, the if-else conditional statement. If you don't know what that is, get ready to have your mind completely blown. There are certain expressions that open up so many possibilities once you understand how to use them, and the if-else conditional statement is one of those expressions. It might seem pretty confusing at first, but I promise as soon as you understand it, it's gonna click, and you're gonna realize how many opportunities this expression really opens up. It's extremely helpful for making things like custom controls, it's helpful for character rigs, there's lots and lots of uses for it. So let's break down exactly what it is and how it works. I'm gonna set up a simple demo by making a circle, and I'll just make it 100 by 100 and fill it with red. Make sure my fill is actually on. There we go. Don't need that stroke, and I'll make it a little bit bigger. So basically what I want to do is add a control that allows me to turn this layer on and off using a checkbox. So first thing I'll do is add a checkbox control. So with the layer selected, I'll come up to Effect, Expression Controls, Checkbox Control. This effect does nothing on its own. It's just a checkbox that I can turn on and off, but it doesn't affect the image. It's there for me to tie expressions to, and that's exactly what we're gonna do. Now, before I write any code, let's talk about the format of an if-else condition. You start off writing a conditional statement with the word if. That's why it's called an if-else. And then you do open and close parentheses, an open curly bracket, a close curly bracket, the word else, another open and close curly bracket, and this might be exactly why if-else conditional statements are kind of confusing, especially at first glance. Now, obviously, this is just the shell of a conditional statement. I haven't put in any information, but let's break down exactly what goes where, and then how to format it so that it's a lot easier to look at. First of all, between these two parentheses is where we put in our condition. Then between these two curly brackets, we put in either a value or some expression code, whatever we want. So we'll just call this value1. Then we have the word else, and then two more curly brackets, and this is where we're gonna put in value2. Now, this is a long line of code and it's hard to look at. Again, none of this stuff is actually filled out, it's all temporary. But the point I wanna make here is that After Effects can see this long line of code, even though it's kind of hard to look at, and it doesn't care. It can read this because it's a computer program, and it doesn't read words and different characters the same way that our brains do. But as a person coding expressions, you can format them in a way that is much easier to look at. So kind of the best practices, the standard way of writing this type of expression is by writing if, and then your condition, the opening curly bracket, drop down a line, and indent. Then after that line, just before the curly bracket, you drop down another line, and you don't indent this one. Then you leave that curly bracket, the word else, and the next curly bracket. You drop down a line, indent, your second line of code, and then you drop down another line, and your condition is written. But looking at it in this format, I can easily see my condition is at the top, then I have my first value, and I know it's a value because it's indented. Then I have the divider, the else part of the statement, and value2, which is also indented, so I can tell these are my two values. And then our final curly bracket. And this last curly bracket, the one just before else, and the word if are all on the same indent, so it's much easier to identify that this is the entirety of my conditional statement. Okay, so now that it's in an easier to read format, let's go back and talk about what all of these sections actually are. In between the parentheses, we have our condition. This is where we're going to tell After Effects what we wanted to calculate, compare, whatever the condition is. In this case, I want to turn a layer's visibility on and off based on a checkbox. So my condition would be if the checkbox is checked, turn the layer on. Else, or otherwise, if it's not checked, turn the layer off. So this is kind of the human readable version of what I want my code to say. If the checkbox is checked, turn the layer on. Otherwise, turn the layer off. Now I'm going to actually convert this to my expression code. First of all, I need code that references the checkbox. I can't just say checkbox because it won't know what I'm actually referencing. So I added a checkbox to my circle layer. So I'm going to drop everything down a couple lines and type var for variable, checkbox equals, and then the code I need to reference that checkbox. So I have a variable for the effect checkbox control checkbox. Now that that variable is defined, I can reference that variable within my condition. So I'm going to say if checkbox is checked, and again, I can't say checked. After Effects doesn't actually know what checked means, so I have to put in a value here. Now, a checkbox returns one of two values, 0 if it's unchecked, and 1 if it is checked. So if the checkbox is equal to 1. Now you'll notice that I put in two equal signs, and that's just how expressions are written with a conditional statement. If you want a value to equal exactly whatever value you're putting in, you write two equal signs. And we'll get into other options in a little bit, but for now, that's how you get something to equal exactly the value you type in. So if the checkbox is checked, or a value of 1, turn the layer on. Now I'm going to apply this expression to the opacity of the layer. That's how I'm going to turn it on and off. So if the checkbox is checked, I want the opacity to be a value of 100 or 100%. Otherwise, and the proper way to write this is else, but it means otherwise, if this is not checked, if this statement is not true, turn the layer off or set the opacity to 0. And that's all there is to this conditional statement. So I define my variable for the checkbox so I can reference it in my condition. I said if the checkbox is checked, turn the opacity to 100%. Otherwise, if it's not checked, if this condition is not met, leave it at 0. So you can kind of think of a conditional statement as a way to be able to apply one of two expressions to any property. So let's apply this to the layer and see if it actually works. Okay, so I have my circle, and I'm going to bring up the opacity, hold down Option or Alt, and click on the stopwatch to add an expression. And I'm just going to paste in all that code that I just wrote out for you. So I have my variable of the checkbox. If the checkbox is checked, make this value 100, otherwise leave it at 0. I'll apply it, and my circle goes away because the checkbox control is unchecked. If I check that box, it comes back. And that's how you can use a conditional statement to control something in its simplest form. I'm going to rename this checkbox on-off switch, and we could easily tie other things to this. So I'm going to write out the text on, and I'll put it right in the middle of that circle. Make it a little bigger. There we go. And I'm just going to copy this expression from my shape layer, and I'm going to go into the text layer, into the source text, add an expression there, and paste that same code. Now this isn't going to work exactly yet. I'm going to get an error because the checkbox expression that I have in my variable isn't referencing the right location. So I'm going to select the main layer that has the checkbox on it and lock the effects controls so that stays visible even if I go to a different layer. Then I'll select the code for that checkbox and use the expression pick whip to select the checkbox. Then it'll fill out the right code that it needs for that variable, and I'll apply it. Now my text changed to 100, and that's because the checkbox is checked, and I still have a value of 100 on my first option if the conditional statement is true. So if the checkbox is checked, I want this text layer to say on. But I can't just type in on like that, unfortunately. The text did go back to on because that's what it originally said, but I'm getting an error. For the source text property, if you want it to return text, you need to put it in quotes. There we go, now it's working. And for the second option, if the checkbox is not checked, I'm going to set this to off. Make sure to put it in quotations. There we go. And I'll uncheck the box. Now there's a problem. The shape layer goes away, so I can't see my text. To fix that, I'm going to add a fill effect. So let's add a fill. And I'm going to add an expression to this fill effect as well. So I'm going to copy the expression that I have on the source text, hold down Option or Alt and click on the color, and paste the expression in there. Now, again, we're going to get some errors, and that's because you can't put a line of text as a value on a color layer. When the checkbox is checked, I want it to be the same color as the background, and when it's off, I want it to be the same color as the circle was. Now, I could write an array for these specific colors, but that's pretty complicated and it's not very flexible. Instead, I'm going to add some more expression controls to this layer. So with the layer selected, I'm going to go up to Effect, Expression Controls, Color Control. So I have a color. I can make it whatever I want. I want one of them to be the background color. So I'll call this color 1, and then I'll duplicate it, color 2, and I want that to be the same color as my text. So I'll just sample that color. There we go. Okay, now that I have those two expression controls, I can reference them as variables in the color property of my fill effect. So I'm going to go into here and add in another variable, color 1. Color 1 equals, and then use the expression pick whip to grab that first color, semicolon to finish that, and then say var color 2 equals, and pick the second color, semicolon. Now that I have those set, I can just change the on and off to these colors. So when the checkbox is checked, I want it to be color 1, so color 1, and when it's off, I want it to be color 2. Apply that, and there we go. Now if I turn my switch off, the text turns red and it now says off. And if I check it, it turns white and changes to say on. And let's say that I still want to see the outline of the circle when it's off. Well, I'll just go to the opacity of this layer and cut that expression out so that it's always at 100%. And instead of on the opacity, I'll go into the contents, into the ellipse, turn my stroke up to say 4, and then find the fill and go to the opacity of that. I could do the exact same expression on that opacity instead of the layer's opacity. So I'll hold Option or Alt, click on the opacity, and paste. Now that's going to work exactly the same. And then I'll come to the stroke opacity, Option or Alt click, paste, but I don't want it to behave the same way. I want it to behave opposite. So I could either change these values so that when it's checked, it's 0, and when it's not checked, it's 100. Or I could just change my condition to say if the checkbox is not checked, and remember an unchecked checkbox returns a value of 0, so if the checkbox equals 0, then it'll be 100, otherwise it'll be 0. I'll apply that, and now I have my outline when it's off and my fill when it's on. So there you go, we've got a lot of different properties being affected by a single checkbox. All right, so that is a conditional statement at its most basic level. But we can do a whole lot more than just saying if something is turned on or off. So I'm going to duplicate this shape layer, and we'll name this first one circle. And I'm going to change this one to square. Go into the contents, turn these other two layers off. And instead of an ellipse, I'm going to add in a square, a rectangle. And I'll make it 300 by 300. There we go. I don't need any expressions on this layer, so I'm just going to get rid of those checkbox controls and get rid of that effect as well. All right, so I have my shape layer. Now I'm going to open up the opacity, and I'll start writing another expression. So I'll start with a variable, var r equals transform.rotation, and that's just going to look at the rotation property of this layer. And then I'll write a conditional statement. I'll say if r, and then instead of saying equals, I'm going to say less than. So if r is less than 90 for 90 degrees, then I'll do a close parentheses, open curly bracket, drop down a line, and indent with the tab key. So if the rotation is less than 90, I'll say the opacity should be 100, drop down a line, else, drop down a line and indent, 0. Drop down a line again, finish it off with a closing curly bracket and a semicolon. So we're going to say if the rotation is less than 90, it should be 100%. Otherwise, it'll be 0%. All right, now that that is set, I can switch to my rotation tool and start rotating. And as soon as I get past 90 degrees, right there, it disappears. Let me bring up my rotation so you can see. There we go. If I type in 90, it's gone. If I bring it down to 89, it comes back. So this is, again, just a very simple conditional statement. But instead of equaling a certain value, the condition is seeing if the property we're looking at is less than a certain value. I could also say greater than instead of less than. So anything less than 90 degrees, and it'll disappear. As soon as it gets past 90, then it'll show up. I could also say if the rotation is less than or equal to 90. So if I type in 90 now, it's going to stay 100% opaque. If I take off that equal sign, then it's no longer true because the rotation is not greater than 90, it is 90 exactly. If I even increase this to 90.1, it will come back because it is greater than 90. So that's something to keep in mind. You can add the equal sign after the greater than or less than symbol to include the number that you're adding as the value. You could also say does not equal using an exclamation mark. So if you say exclamation mark equals, that's saying if the rotation does not equal 90 degrees, make it 100%, otherwise leave it at 0. My rotation is set to exactly 90, so it's going to be 0. But on any other value than exactly 90, it's going to be 100% opaque. All right, I'm going to set this back to if rotation is less than or equal to 90, and that way it's visible up until 90 degrees. And we can expand this out a little bit further. Instead of just having one condition, we can actually have multiple conditions. So I'm going to say if the rotation is less than or equal to 90, and that's using the vertical bar, which is shift and the / key. 2 of those in a row means or in a conditional statement. And then I can write in another condition. So let's say the rotation is greater than or equal to 180, then we'll return the same 2 values. So if it's less than or equal to 90, we can see it. As soon as it's greater than 90, it goes away. But if I keep going, as soon as we get beyond 180 degrees, it comes back. So that's how you can isolate a certain range of values on a property. And you can add as many of these as you want. So I could keep saying or if it's greater than 360 degrees, you can add as many of these conditions in between these parentheses as you want. And there's one other method that's very useful with conditional statements. Instead of saying or, we could do 2 ampersands, and that means and. So both of these conditions have to be true for this value to be returned. So if the rotation is less than or equal to 90 and the rotation is greater than or equal to 180, return a value of 100. Now that's never going to be true. The value can't be less than 90 and greater than 180. So let's just reverse these. If the rotation is greater than 90 and less than 180, then do that. Now it's only going to be visible between 90 degrees and 180 degrees. So there we go. Now I'm using the rotation value for both of these conditions, but I don't even have to do that. If I added in another variable and called it s for transform.scale, and I'm just going to target the x scale, open square bracket, 0 for the first number in the array, the x value, close square bracket. Now I could say something like if the rotation is greater than or equal to 90 and the scale is less than, say, 50%, then apply this. And I'll just bring up the scale, Shift S to bring up the scale. And now if I bring my scale down below 50, there we go. It appears and it disappears at anything above it. But this is also looking at the rotation value. So if the rotation is less than 90, I'll turn this down, it also disappears, even if this one is above 100, because both of these conditions have to be met for this to be true. If I changed it from and to or, then if either one of these conditions are met, then we'll apply the first value. So I'll bring this down below 50, there we go. Or if it's above 50, as long as this is above 90, it comes back. So there are a whole lot of different ways that you can configure your conditional statement to get your expressions to behave exactly the way that you want them to. And you can see that I'm using variables in my conditions. So you could have complex equations or variables referencing other expression controls, all kinds of different things, and make these conditions extremely complex or extremely simple. And you can go a level deeper and make it even more complex by putting a conditional statement within a condition. So we could say if the rotation is greater than or equal to 90 and leave it at that, then instead of putting in a value, I'm going to just start writing another if-else conditional statement. So if s is greater than 50, greater than or equal to 50, then I'll just continue indenting another line, and we'll say 50, indent else 25. I'm just changing up the numbers a little bit, but you see that I just indented everything in this format right here is exactly the same as the outer condition, but because it's indented, it's very clear to see that this is its own statement but it's being contained within a larger statement. So first, this expression is going to look and see, is the rotation greater than or equal to 90? If the answer is yes, which it is, then it's going to see if the scale is greater than or equal to 50. If it is, we're going to put the opacity to 50%. If it's not, we're going to put the opacity to 25%. You can see that shift right there. As soon as I cross 50, it drops from 50% opacity to 25% opacity. Now, something very important to bring up at this point for conditional statements is that once a condition is met, it's going to return whatever the first value that you set for that conditional statement is, and it's going to stop. So in this case, this first statement was true. It went to the first value, not the second one, and that value happened to be another statement. So it then looked at that statement, and it also was true. So it put in a value of 50, and it stopped right there. It's not going to consider anything else you put beyond that line. If this statement was false, which it is right now, it ignored this first line, went to the else at 25%, and it again ignored everything else beyond it. So keep that in mind when you're writing your statements. To complicate this even further, you don't have to have a single if-else statement. You can add another if. So I'm going to drop this line down, and instead of just saying else, I'm going to put a closing curly bracket again, and just start writing another if. So if, and this time we'll say if the scale is exactly equal to 120%, then I want the opacity to be 75%. And then we can finish it off the same way with this else. I'll apply that, and my opacity is now set to 0. So let's break down what's happening. First of all, if the rotation is greater than or equal to 90, it is. It's going to go into here. So immediately, we're going into the first conditional statement, which means we're never going to get to the next conditional statement. So I'm going to turn my rotation down to 45. All right, it's still a 0 opacity, so what's happening? Well, the first statement isn't true, so it's going to skip over all of this and go to my second if-else statement, which is if the scale is exactly 120%. It's not, so it's going to skip over that line, go down to the next part of my expression, which is the else, or otherwise, if none of these statements are true, just put in a value of 0. If I change this to 100, it jumps up to 100. So let's make this statement true. If scale is 120, let's type in 120 on the scale. Now the opacity is 75, which I set right here. And you can do as many layers of conditional statements as you want, and sometimes you might need to, depending on what you're building with your expressions. It can get very complicated very quickly, and that's why this format of indenting, dropping down a line and indenting every time you add another conditional statement is extremely important for staying organized visually. And I also like to use variables that are very short. I try to use as few letters as possible as long as I can understand what they mean so that my code is much easier to look at and read. And like I said, once you've used these conditional statements more and more, you're going to be able to start reading these much more naturally. And even though it might seem really complex looking at it right now, it becomes much easier to look at and understand the more you actually write your own expressions. So that's conditional statements, and hopefully now you see just how powerful they are in your expressions workflow inside of After Effects. If you didn't know how to use them before, that should open the door to so many more possibilities for you. And we kind of only scratched the surface with what the possibilities really are. You can make them so complex. And I've made some rigs like the tapered stroke rig that I did for School of Motion that had condition after condition with lots of complex expressions. You should definitely go check that out if you haven't seen it. I did a 2-part lesson where I explain exactly how I made this entire really complex rig. You can download it, dissect it, look at how I coded it exactly. So check that out on School of Motion's website. I'll put the link in the description of this video. But like I said, the possibilities are pretty much endless, and there's so much more you can do with conditional statements. So definitely check that out. And if anything was a little bit confusing to you, don't hesitate to ask. I'd love to make some follow-up tutorials with this, clarifying anything that you didn't understand, adding to it, because there are definitely some more clever things that you can do with conditional statements to get rigs or whatever you're coding really to behave exactly the way that you want it to. I hope that you enjoyed this guide, and now you have a better understanding of what a conditional statement is. If you liked it, I would appreciate if you liked the video, share it on social media so other people can find out about my channel. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so that you know when I post new tutorials. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.